Okay, we're going to get started. On behalf of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, producer of the Virginia Festival of the Book, I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel, Civil Protests, Bloody Responses, Kent State and Selma. My name is Dan Doernberg. I'm the president of the public interest group Fairness.com. Our free online discussion annotation tool, Now Comment, was piloted at UVA and has been used in over 3,000 other schools worldwide since 2008. Some quick housekeeping before we start. Thanks to our sponsors, the City of Charlottesville, for providing the venue for today's event. And we want to welcome all of our viewers on C-SPAN and Charlottesville's own TV 10. During the Q&A portion, we ask that you please wait for a microphone to be brought to you so that your questions can be recorded. The festival is free of charge, but it's not free of cost. So please at some point go online to give back or make a donation at one of the information desk donation boxes that I think is at the Omni and maybe some other spots, so that we can keep the festival free for many years to come. At the end of the talk, everyone should have some evaluation forms, the kind of greenish things. The festival is always interested in knowing what you like and what you don't like and what topics we should do in the future. So please complete those and turn them back. And finally, our authors today are going to stay after the event to sign books and chat with you. So please, it's another way to support the festival, to purchase books and help them out in local booksellers. So those are all the standard announcements, and there's a new one this year that's pretty important. As you've likely heard, the recently released White House budget blueprint eliminates the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. For 50 years, the NEA and the NEH have supported programs like the Virginia Festival of the Book, reaching nearly every American with opportunities to understand, to discover new perspectives, to celebrate, reflect, and engage. We need your help to urge Congress to preserve the NEA and the NEH. Please take 5 minutes sometime soon to call your representative after the program. It really does matter. The Virginia Foundation has some information on their website, virginiahumanities.org/advocate. So that's the housekeeping, and on to the program. Today's authors have written books about tragic events by state governments in times of tremendous political polarization. Selma is a story of incredible courage in the face of brutal suppression that was fully expected. At Kent State, a confluence of mistakes and naivete led to bloodshed that was totally unexpected. Both books feel very timely, as many Americans now ponder what behavioral norms and limits a potentially authoritarian government might disregard in our own era of intense polarization. So let me introduce the authors. Howard Means is the author of 67 Shots, Kent State, and the End of American Innocence. He's co-authored or authored 10 books, including the first biography of Colin Powell and Louis Freeh's memoir. Means was a former columnist and senior editor at Washington Magazine, and he lives in rural Virginia near Winchester, you said?
Right.
Okay.
Very rural.
Yeah, but very Virginia. Robert Pratt is the author of Selma's Bloody Sunday, Protest, Voting Rights, and the Struggle for Racial Equality. Professor Pratt teaches history at the University of Virginia. He's also the author of The Color of Their Skin, recognized as an outstanding book by the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Human Rights, and We Shall Not Be Moved.
At the University of Georgia.
University of Georgia.
I read that wrong. It says the University of Georgia. Thank you.
I studied at the University of Virginia.
Oh, did I say Virginia?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Does this mean I don't get an A? Sorry about that.
B+.
Yeah. So the first presentation, which of you wanted to
I
start?
think I was going to start. But
Go for it.
I studied at the University of Virginia, too, many, many years ago. Was anybody here? Let me start up. Was anybody here at Kent State in 1970? Were you? 1, 2. It's amazing how many people. Every time I go somewhere and give a talk, there's at least 2 people in the crowd who were there. Were you on the Commons at the time?
I was
Were you? Okay. Yeah, when the riots and when the rioting was going on? Yeah. And how about you? Were you?
No, I was not.
Okay, yeah. There were 21,000 students at Kent State. Nobody heard of Kent State, basically, nationally. At the national level, it was a regional university primarily devoted to training teachers in those days for the high schools, the schools, public schools in Northeast Ohio. But there were 1,000 people on the mall, on the commons where all this took place, and there were 20,000 people elsewhere, obviously, at that time, too, going to classes, many of them. Okay, and back there, I know is a guy who covered it, Dean Schott, who, for a newspaper, was it Gannett? That's right, the Kent, yeah, right. Okay, a little bit of a chronology for those of you that need a little refresher course on what and when happened, what happened when. April 30th, 1970, address to the nation, nighttime address to the nation. Richard Nixon announces that rather than being contracted, the number of U.S. forces in Vietnam were being expanded. The war was going to be carried across the Cambodian border to interdict supply lines. To any soldier who was serving in Vietnam at that time, it was a surprise that the war wasn't already across the border into Cambodia. But it had an expected blowback at colleges and universities across the country, and it happened at Kent State on Friday night, May 1, with chronology. About 11 o'clock, there are a whole bunch of bars downtown along Water Street, and about 11 o'clock, people start building fires in garbage cans out in the street, as you'll recall, and they start rocking cars, stopping cars, rocking cars. About 12 o'clock, it gets worse. Probably a hardcore of 10 to 15 people, 20 people are run down a commercial street. They start throwing things through windows. The mayor estimates it's done $40,000 worth of damage. In fact, it turns out to be closer to $5,000 to $10,000 worth of damage. But at 2 that morning, a fateful moment in this whole story, the mayor calls the office of Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes to inquire about bringing the National Guard to Kent State. Now, it turns out it's an easy thing for Rhodes to decide for several reasons. I'll get to the larger one later. The Guard is already in Akron, about 20 minutes away, where they've been putting down a Teamster strike. They've got lots of firepower over there, easy to bring them over. Still, they negotiate all day Saturday. And then at Saturday night, it's 5 o'clock Saturday, they decide to bring the Guard. The Guard shows up at 8 o'clock on Saturday. Oops, wrong way, I got to go back. This is it. This is when the Guard shows up. The flame in the background is the Army ROTC building. The Guard shows up simultaneously with the ROTC building going up in flames. It gets much worse later that night, lots of running confrontations. Sunday, Jim Rhodes, the governor, shows up at Kent State. He tells a press conference that they're no longer going to treat the symptoms of campus unrest, they're going to eradicate the problem of campus unrest. This is in line with what Ronald Reagan had said about 2 months earlier in California. If it takes blood to stop this campus unrest, then let there be blood, basically is what he said. So, Sunday night, more confrontation, and then we come to Monday. This is right here. This is the Commons. This is the hillside at the back of the Commons you'll see in a moment. This fellow right here is Jeffrey Miller, and he'll be dead in 22 minutes. The Guard is at the other end of this long expanse, and at exactly noon, the Guard moves out. Those are the kids on the hillside we just looked at. That smoke, of course, is tear gas, the Chanel number 5 of the protest movement. And that's Taylor Hall. The students will be pushed over both sides, around both sides of that large building at the top. And they'll go down into, their commander marches them down into a cul-de-sac, basically. They were terribly led. It's just horrible what these people were asked to do and leadership they were given. They're terribly led. He marched them down to a cul-de-sac. It's a practice field, a football practice with fencing on both sides. So they can't go this way, they can't go that way, and the students are right out in front of them. Furthermore, it's a construction site, which gives the students a chance to grab some rocks and 2x4s and start hurling them at the Guard. The Guard starts back up the hill at the pagoda right here, about 2/3 of the way back up the hill. The Guard turns. They go into crouch. They begin firing into the crowd. Here are the students in the Prentice Hall parking lot, diving for cover. And then this is the iconic photo of the whole thing, practically. This is just before the iconic photo. You'll remember the photo with this woman, Marion Vecchio, with her arms up in there. This photo, to me, is more powerful because it's the moment she realizes she's looking at a dead person. This guy has bled out in seconds. And I'll more about that later. And then the people. Well, I'm going to hold that a second. Let me go back. Okay, so Marion Vecchio is the iconic. She actually is a 14-year-old runaway from Opa-locka, Florida, who wandered into Kent State because she heard there was a good dance club there. She is not political in the least. She happens to be caught up in this whole thing. So there she is. And the question that I set out to answer in the book is, why did this happen? Three theories. The first is the conspiracy theory that's still very popular among your classmates in the class in 1970 at Kent State when you go to the reunions. And that is that Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover ginned the whole thing up. They inspired this sort of revolt on the campus so they could put it down. In fact, just the opposite happened, really. Nixon instructed Hoover to find the outsiders, the agitators who'd caused all this. Hoover couldn't. Nixon lost faith in Hoover, and that's when he started his plumbers group, because he didn't think the FBI could give him the people he wanted to give him. He thought they were incompetent. That's theory one. Theory two is the kind of global meta view of the whole thing. And if you step back and you look at these things from 30,000 feet, there's an inevitability almost to it. It's like the metaphor I kept coming up with is Titanic and the iceberg. All these toxic waters of the 60s, and Robert's going to talk about those too, flowed together for reasons that are discernible if you look at it hard enough, at this one college in Northeast Ohio, and an inevitable collision occurred. And it has that sort of feel to it when you look at it. But then when you get down into it and you start breaking the story apart, what you see is that every party to the horror of what happened at Kent State, the university, the governor's office, the students, the guard, everybody had options. Everybody could have turned away from this happening, and nobody did. Nobody had a plan B when plan A went bad. And that's when this whole collision occurs. Finally, though, when you talk about all that, but you get down to the fruit of all this, the horror fruit. This is Jeff Miller. Jeff Miller is 21 years old. He was shot in the mouth from 75 yards away with an M1. The coroner said the gross aspect was horrible, horrendous, I believe. Allison Krause, a freshman who was an honors student. She was in the honors college and was a very tempting target in part because she was tall and attractive. She was a good-looking woman and she was around a lot during the thing. She was shot in the left side under the arm, and it basically penetrated all of her viscera. Bill Schroeder over here stopped by to see what was happening. He was a freshman football player, freshman basketball player. He was number 2 in his Army ROTC class. He was simply standing there between classes trying to figure out what was happening, and he was shot in the thorax. The guy who was next to him said it picked him up off the ground and threw him backwards. These are M1s they were shooting with. These are Army battle rifles. It's insane to control a crowd with Army battle rifles. It's the ultimate insanity of this thing. This is the one that always breaks my heart. Sandy Shearer, excuse me, I always get choked up when I talk about her. Sandy Shearer was walking between classes. A friend of hers was walking beside her, a guy named Ellis Burns. He heard the shooting. He grabbed her, pushed her down on the ground, said, "Sandy, stay down." So they get down. The shooting stops. He says, "Sandy, it's okay to get up." She had been shot from 130 yards away through her jugular vein. It just it breaks your heart at any rate. It breaks mine. So this is the outcome of the whole thing. And then just one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to Robert. Sorry, I should have these notes loose. The bottom to me is that what happened at Kent State was a tragedy for the nation. It was a tragedy for the university. It was a tragedy also for the guardsmen who were sent out to do an impossible job with the wrong equipment, terribly led. And many of them I found in the course of doing talks about this still suffer from that. They were asked to do the impossible. A lot of them panicked inside their gas mask and did fire guns, and they're filled with deep regret. What happened to them was horrible, but of course ultimately the greatest tragedy is for these 4 people and for Dean Taylor, who was paralyzed from the waist down, still alive. He's a wonderful guy and a lesson in forgiveness. So, on that note, Robert, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Let me begin, let me follow Howard's lead and ask if anyone was in Selma in 1965. We talked earlier, yes. Let me give you a little chronology, just for the sake of those who are not familiar with this. The Civil Rights Act had been passed in 1964. It took some arm twisting by President Johnson, exerted his influence on Southern lawmakers, particularly those who had, for many years, constituted what they called the Southern Bloc, led by Georgia's own Richard B. Russell and others. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as many of you know, had a provision that was for voting. But at the last minute, Southern lawmakers watered down the voting rights provision. And by late 64, early 65, it was apparent that voting rights legislation was needed because black people were still being brutalized throughout the South, especially in the deep South states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where the violence was worse. And so they needed this legislation, and so it took the courage of a few people to really make this happen, and they wanted to dramatize what was taking place in Selma. And so a woman named Amelia Boynton, that name may be familiar to some of you, she really was the mother of the Selma movement. And what I try to do in this book is really to bring to life the stories of these individual people. Obviously, people like Martin Luther King and civil rights icon John Lewis will figure prominently in this narrative, but there were so many other people who worked, put their lives on the line on a daily, nightly basis. Amelia Boynton was born in 1911, and when she turned 21 in 1932, she registered to vote. She was one of a handful of African American people who had been able to successfully navigate all of the difficulties in trying to get registered to vote in Selma, Alabama, if you were black. But she had done so, and she used her time to help educate other black people about the voting rights process and how to be registered, as did her husband, Sam Boynton. So they were both dedicated civil rights activists. So much so that when her husband, Sam, died in 1963, she used the occasion of his funeral to disseminate information about voting rights to all the people who came. Because at that time, if you trying to register to vote in the Deep South, you could be murdered. The only thing that would place your life in even greater danger would be if you were actively trying to educate and get other people registered. So if you were a voter, your life was in danger, but your life was even greater danger if you were an organizer, as she and her husband both were. And she used the occasion of his funeral to do this. So hers is one of the stories that comes to life in this drama. So she actually was the one who invited the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. She invited SNCC to come to Selma to begin a voter registration campaign. There was a man named Bernard Lafayette, who is still alive. He's on the faculty as distinguished professor in residence at Emory University in Atlanta. And he has shared a story with me and others from time to time that he wanted to be in charge of a field project, as many of the young SNCC leaders were. But by the time he had been sent on some campaign to raise money, and by the time he got back, he was told that all the assignments had been handed out. He could be somebody's assistant. He said, I don't want to be anybody's assistant. I want my own project. And there was a map of the Deep South that was on the wall in the office, and there was a red X through the state of Alabama. And he said, why is there a red X through Alabama? And James Foreman told him, he said, well, that's because we have sent some people out, some scouts. And the consensus is that the whites are too mean and the Negroes are too afraid. And so we think it best not to pursue anything in Alabama. But he said, we had done some initial legwork in a place called Selma. He says, you can go and check it out if you want to. And he says, no, I don't want to check it out, I want to take it. And so that's how the SNCC base got set up in Selma. It was the same Amelia Boynton who sent word to Martin Luther King Jr. to bring his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to Selma. So because of her involvement, both of these organizations come to Selma. And so she really is the mother of the movement. But so we have all the events that lead up to what you know as Bloody Sunday. March 7th, 1965, when several hundred of the parishioners who had left Brown Chapel in Selma went to the bridge to march over, led by Hosea Williams of SCLC and John Lewis of SNCC. The march to Selma to Montgomery, as many of you know, really sort of took place after a murder in Marion, Alabama. There was an African-American young man. He was the youngest deacon in his church. His name was Jimmy Lee Jackson. And he was trying to protect his mother and his grandfather from being brutalized by white policemen on this particular night. And he was shot by a state trooper twice in the abdomen, point-blank range. He died about 7 or 8 days later. Some of the folks in SNCC and SCLC were very angry that he had been murdered for really nothing. And someone came up with the idea we should march with Jimmy Lee Jackson's body all the way from Selma to Montgomery and dump his body at the foot of the Capitol, so Governor George Wallace can see what his brutality has created. And then, but that was sort of in a metaphorical sense. And somebody says, maybe that's a good idea. We won't march with his body, but symbolically, we will carry Jimmy Lee Jackson to Montgomery. So that's how the idea of the Selma to Montgomery March was born. And on March 7th, 1965, when the marchers came face to face with the state troopers that had been ordered by Governor Wallace and by Sheriff Jim Clark of Dallas County, you know the rest of the story that became Bloody Sunday. You saw the beating. Anybody who has not seen the footage? Okay, you've seen the footage of Bloody Sunday, but I'm going to share something with you now that you haven't seen. And the reason you haven't seen it is because you probably don't know about it, and because there was a concerted attempt to cover it up. Many people believe that the beating stopped on the bridge. The beating did not stop on the bridge. The state troopers from Alabama and the posse from Dallas County and Selma pursued those marchers back across the bridge into Selma, where they beat those folk for the rest of the night. They beat them with rubber hoses wrapped with barbed wire. There were a couple of journalists who were on hand to capture it. What would often happen in these nighttime events is that whites would often bring with them cans of black spray paint, and they would spray the lenses of cameras so that the events could not be recorded. And that's what happened on that night. But the beating continued until well into the early hours of the next morning. Some of the blacks and the white supporters had sought refuge in a nearby church, and so they ran into the church, trying to get away from the policemen and the state troopers, thinking that would give them refuge, thinking that they might respect the sanctity of the church. But they did not. They pursued them into the church, fired tear gas inside the church, took one 16-year-old black boy, threw him out through a stained glass window. The violence and the horror of that night. I had a conversation with a woman named Joanne Bland. She's somebody who has not come up in previous research, but she's a living institution and historian in Selma, and I've had the good fortune to talk with her many times over the years. But she was 11 years old when she was on the bridge that day. She was not beaten, but her 14-year-old sister was beaten. And she said one of the things that she remembers most was the horses. The people were blinded because of the tear gas, which burns your eyes and burns your lungs, and you had this fog and you can't see. and you are disoriented. And so in many instances, people were running right back into the people they were trying to get away from. And so there was this one instance where this woman trying to run away from a state trooper ran directly into the path of an oncoming horse. And the horse hit her with such force that her head hit the pavement. And she said that was sort of an image that she will never forget. Here is a child 11 years old. There are many personal stories that come out of Selma, many people who gave their lives. Jimmy Lee Jackson, the African-American who was the martyr of Selma, but he was one of two. The Reverend James Reeb would be murdered a couple of nights later because he was a white Unitarian minister. He's misidentified in the movie Selma as a priest, but he was a Unitarian minister. He had come with several others, and they had eaten dinner at a black restaurant, but they made the mistake of going past the Silver Moon Cafe. They got too close to it. The Silver Moon Cafe was one of the most notorious racist establishments in Selma. It was the only white restaurant in Selma that black and whites would not go into to test the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They were afraid to go in there. But there were some patrons coming out of that, and they saw these three white men walking past, and they said, "Where are you white niggers going?" And so they pursued them, and one of them picked up some kind of club 2x4, hit Reverend Reeb in his head, killed him. He would die several days later. And then there was Viola Liuzzo, who was murdered the night that the march concluded. And so these are some of the personal stories that really come through in this narrative. And it's the hope that, we think that some of these issues are past history, but if you look at some of the shenanigans that are now taking place with various voter registration laws and voter suppression laws, these are battles and that we thought we had fought and we had won 50 years ago. But I think in state after state, several states now, a couple of districts, voting districts in Wisconsin were recently found to be in violation of the Voting Rights Act. There are several in Georgia that are being threatened because of gerrymandering. And when you have people like President Trump who says he would have won the popular vote but for 3 million illegal votes cast, that only gives more fuel to those who would impose more voting restrictions. So the idea is to limit access to the ballot. So issues that we thought we had successfully won, we find that we have not. So the struggle continues.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to ask the authors 2 questions and then do quick ones with quick answers, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Both of your books describe the great disparities in national attitudes, varying attitudes toward killings depending on the race of the victim. In Professor Pratt's book, you just mentioned the killing of the Unitarian minister and how that made a much greater national, got more attention than the killings of many similar black clergymen and activists. And Howard's book, you talk about the difference between Kent State and Jackson State and the shootings that happened there. So I was wondering if you would both talk about in your books those disparities in attitude, and then as just a quick follow-up, also comment on the current Black Lives Matter movement and how that ties into disparities about attitudes toward killing victims.
Sure. You want me to start off? One of the sort of moments in this book, there were virtually no black students at Kent State who took part in the protests against the Vietnam War, not because they didn't have feelings about the Vietnam War, but because once the Guard got on campus, they could see the danger they were in. They were from Toledo. They were from places where blacks had been subjected to police brutality. The white kids in the campus were largely, a lot of them from rural places. They had a naive view of the world. And so the moment on Saturday night, the cafeteria is open and this group of black students walks in, and I talked to a woman named Viral Harrington who was in charge of the cafeteria. Said I looked up and here were all these Black Panthers rushing into the cafeteria. They all rushed in and they sat down at the table and they said, You see us here. We are not out there. We're here. They wanted to have a witness that they were there and not out on the campus so somebody could come and get them. And at the moment they said that, the ROTC building catches on fire and the window behind them is filled with flame. I mean, it's a powerful moment. As for the Jackson State, Kent State, Kent State happens on May 4th, and everybody says this can't happen again. And on May 15th, 11 days later, Jackson State, 2 students killed, Mississippi State policemen, highway patrolmen, I guess they're called, spray. There's a riot because a rumor has swept the campus that Medgar Evers' brother Charles had been murdered. Rumor sweeps the campus. The students go into protest mode. Early in the morning of May 15th, the police decide they've had enough. They spray the front of the campus with 158 automatic rounds and killed 2 people in the process. So you probably heard of the Kent State. I mean, some of you have probably forgotten about the Jackson State. Jackson State is a one-day wonder, basically, in the newspaper. The Scranton Commission does a long study of both these, the Bill Scranton Commission on campus violence, and it devotes, I would say, 70 to 75% of its space to Kent State, 25% to Jackson State. And I say in the book, and for whatever reason, I mean, sadly it's true, that Kent State was a man bites dog story. And Jackson State was a dog bites man story in the Deep South for Mississippi State Highway Patrolmen to be spraying African Americans with gunfire was horrible and reprehensible, but it was a dog bites man story. It was too common a story for the press to spend much time on. And then let Robert go and then come back to the other question. Sure. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that really incurred the wrath of civil rights activists during this period was really the double standard, the way that the federal government, the general public, the press perceived the deaths of white and black activists, that there was a certain special status or sanctity assigned to white life that had not been assigned to black life. Anybody in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, when the 3 civil rights workers went missing, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the FBI sends down hundreds of agents looking for really the 2 white boys, Schwerner and Goodman. But Cheney happened to be with them, and so they came looking. In the process of looking for these 3 civil rights workers, they found several other bodies of blacks who had been murdered and had been gone missing for years. But it elicited very little attention in the press. There was no outcry about these people who had been found because they were black, which prompted a lot of anger from a lot of SNCC activists, especially Stokely Carmichael. He said, what you want is a government that is moved when any of us is killed. But what we see is a government that's moved only when white people are killed. So what are you saying? And so you have a similar dynamic that takes place in Selma when Jimmy Lee Jackson was the first who is murdered, whose death becomes really the catalyst for the march itself. And when he's murdered, there is really no public outcry. There is really no acknowledgement from the president, Lyndon Johnson, no condolences sent to his family. But when the Unitarian minister James Reeb is murdered, President Johnson calls his widow, and he sends his own private plane down to Selma to fly them back. So, I mean, they get the red carpet, the state treatment, and there is simply no response at all from the government to the brutal murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. Similarly, when Viola Liuzzo is murdered, who happens to be the only white woman to be killed in the civil rights movement because she is white and female. Johnson has daily conversations with J. Edgar Hoover about how we need to wrap this up very quickly. And I don't want to get started on Hoover. But Hoover tried, once he found out that as you know the story, when Viola Liuzzo, she had a black male passenger with her in the car that night. Viola Liuzzo had been a civil rights, a lot of people think she came to Selma just for a one-time thing. But she had been an activist in Michigan for years. She was a member of the NAACP, and she came to Selma in 1965 because she said she was called to come. And so she worked with black families while she was there in the days leading up to Bloody Sunday. And on the night that the march was concluded, marchers were faced with the daunting task of figuratively and literally getting out of town before sundown, because they realized that now they've got to travel back to the places of origin, and moving around in the South that night is going to be very dangerous. And so the Reverend James Orange, who was an SCLC activist, had encouraged all of them to make sure that their cars were in convoys and to drive in buses to give them some measure of safety. Viola Uzzo, who had a car with Michigan tags, volunteered to put her car in the convoy. And James Orange says, no, we don't need you to do that, Vi. We got enough cars. Your car with Michigan tags, you're going to be an easy target. But she insisted. And so on one of her trips back, she had a black male passenger whose name was Leroy Moten. And their car, they were followed. When they stopped at a gas station to get gas, they were followed by some local Klansmen, and they pulled up beside them. One of the people in the car was an FBI informant. And he said in order to earn his bona fides with the rest, he put his gun out the window, and everybody starts shooting. No one knows exactly who fired the fatal shot, and Viola Uzzo was killed instantly. Leroy Moten was uninjured, but he escaped with his life because when the Klansmen came back to inspect the bodies, he played dead. And I've often tried to imagine myself in that situation, how if I could even be still. Mm-hmm. But he played dead and he survived. And so FBI was actually involved in the shooting. And so at that point, Hoover tried to smear Viola Uzzo's campaign and said that she had needle track marks on her arm because she was a junkie, and that the setting had all the appearances of a necking party because there was a male Negro in the car. And so he engaged in this smear campaign. But Johnson really tried to clean this up as quickly as he could. But again, you have this whole issue of this sanctity being assigned to white life that had never been assigned to the blacks.
So let me add that second part of the question for him, and we'll start with you, Robert. So how do you see, both from the research you did for the book and life experience, how do you perceive the Black Lives Matter movement in this broader historical context?
Well, I think, we have two interesting phenomena sort of occurring simultaneously in this nation's history, the Black Lives Matter and the Donald Trump movement. And where they converge is going to be very interesting. We should be around to see that, hopefully, to see how this drama plays out in the next few years. But the issue is, and there have been those in recent months who have tried to minimize the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement. They try to minimize it or trivialize it by saying, well, all lives matter. Blue lives matter. Well, we get that, and we know that all lives matter. But the point is that when this nation has a history of this kind of inhumane, brutal treatment aimed at African Americans, especially males, and we now have the luxury of being able to see this captured on film, then it adds another whole dimension. I maintain that this is not necessarily a black and white issue. It's a black and blue issue. It's an issue of African Americans, and in some instances Latinos, whose communities are being heavily patrolled by almost an invading enemy. You've got police officers with tanks, with all kinds of weaponry, and it is overkill. And the reality is that we have now learned that the evidence won't save us, because when you can have, you can catch it on film, the images of an African-American man, Walter Scott, in Charleston, South Carolina, who is clearly running. Well, he's not even running because he can't run. He's hobbling, if you've seen the video, running from a white police officer who shoots him several times in the back. That's murder. But you can't get a conviction because one person on the jury said he couldn't bring himself to vote. And so until there is reform in the criminal justice system, you're going to continue to have these kinds of issues. And, it's anybody's guess where these things go. But you have Eric Garner in New York, who was strangled to death in an illegal police chokehold. You hear the man say, "I can't breathe," and there is not even an indictment. So until the government is willing to address these issues, there will continue to be protests. And I say this, that whatever progress we have made in this country is the outcome of struggle. Progress is not a function of natural evolution. Things don't just happen. It is the outcome of protest and struggle.
Okay. Howard?
Yeah, I think there's a very direct connection between what happened at Kent State, what happened at Ferguson, what happened in Baltimore, what happens time again, you have these confrontations. And the lesson is that more firepower does not make anybody safer. I mean, what happened at Kent State was you had this succession of actions. The Guard comes in. The Guard came in with a maximum 1,347 guardsmen. They had M1s. They had 150 heavy-duty trucks, tanks, personnel carriers, armed personnel carriers. They had 15 helicopters. You might remember the helicopters flying overhead at night. I don't know, but the sky was filled with helicopters all night long, and they scared the people of Kent as well as scaring the students too. And it didn't make anybody safer. What it did was turn this from a protest against the Vietnam War into a protest against the presence, the occupation of the Guard. And so the whole thing turned around, and now instead of having a third-person boogeyman, the Vietnam War, that everybody could at least agree on as to the protest was about, they were directly protesting each other. They were throwing bricks and stones at or rocks at the Guard. Not a lot, I have to say. That was very much exaggerated. But in the same thing, the Guardsmen had these M1s because that's what was left in National Guard armories because everything else had gone to Vietnam. This is what was left as a World War II battle rifle. We get the same thing. We were talking about this over lunch. You get all this excess Pentagon equipment, which the Pentagon gives to police departments to justify their budget requests for more equipment. And so you have police departments in towns like Baltimore and even in St. Louis, Ferguson, that has equipment that was basically made to go door to door in Kabul. And it creates its own reality. And that is, I think, the really horrible lesson of Kent State for modern times.
Okay, I'm going to open things up to the audience for very short general interest questions, and we'll try and get as many as we can. And let's see, wait for the microphone to come to you because this is being broadcast. So let's see. Well, over here we'll start.
Hi, this is for both authors, and I was wondering when you first got interested in writing about Kent State and Selma, and then how long it took you to write these books.
Oh boy, I was a high school teacher when Kent State happened. I was teaching high school seniors, kids who were in two cases only 1 year younger than the kids who were killed. I was 23, the age of the Guardsmen, basically. And I sat down that night. I went home. I fancied myself a poet in those days. Thank goodness I got over that. It's bad enough being what I am now. And I went home and I wrote what I think was the perfect sonnet about Kent State. I never wrote anything so beautiful in my life. And about 8 years ago, I thought, gee, I'd like to see that sonnet and see what it said. And it was in a manuscript I'd submitted somewhere, and it was the one poem missing from the manuscript. And it just sort of haunted me that I'd lost this thing. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book about it instead. And so I just started gathering stuff. And I wasn't sure there was a book there. I mean, there was a sort of a standard interpretation of what had happened at Kent State. And everybody's basically heard it. The Guardsmen were all bad. The students were all good. The university was caught in the fix. And it was caught in the middle somehow. And then you look at it and you start taking it apart, and it was just a story I felt I had to write. The actual writing took about 2 years probably, but I was really helped because there was a unused stash of about 130 oral histories sitting in the Kent State archives. So I had these first-person recollections of all these people. I could go back to some of them to ask them further questions. Some of them were dead. And it was at that sort of at the cusp of finding people who were still alive in the faculty who'd been there, and I found a bunch of those. So I felt compelled, and I had the leisure to do it, and I had an advance to do it with.
Robert, how about you?
For about 10 years, I served as the lead historian on several Teaching American History grants. These were wonderful grants, $1 million grants, and they allowed educators to work with teachers, elementary, middle, high school teachers. Some of you may have been involved. We've been serenaded. Some of you may have been involved in some of these grants, but they were wonderful. I think these grants are about to be killed if Trump gets his way with the NEH and the NEA.
Unless we make our phone calls.
Unless you make your phone calls, precisely.
Right.
And we had a civil rights tour, and we would go from Atlanta to Tuskegee, from Tuskegee to Montgomery, from Montgomery to Selma, Selma to Birmingham, Birmingham to Memphis. And so I had been toying with the idea of doing a book on Selma for a long time, because in Selma I would meet people such as Joanne Bland, who recounts the story of she and her sister being on the bridge and her sister being beaten. A man named Willie Bolden, who talked about the same night Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered, that a police officer stopped him, put a gun in his mouth, cocked the trigger back, didn't pull it, but yanked the gun out and broke 2 of his teeth. Mm-hmm. And I would get these, and this story is also in the book, and I would get these personal stories from people in Selma, and I said, I need to do this, because there had been books on Selma. Mine is not the first. David Garrett did a very fine book, Protest at Selma, some years ago, and then Taylor Branch, you know Taylor Branch, he writes these humongous things. He's where he gets the energy, I don't know. But his third in the trilogy, At Canaan's Edge, he has a good section on Selma. But I wanted something really personal. And I've been toying with the idea, and I was approached by folk at Johns Hopkins Press because they were doing a series called Witness to History. And Selma got a lot of renewed publicity after the movie with Oprah Winfrey and all the others. And they said, we want something that's going to appeal to the general public, not something that's going to take weeks and weeks to read, but something that gets at the juicy parts. It took me about 2.5, 3 years to pull together research, make trips to Selma, do a lot of oral history, and complete this project.
Okay. Are there other questions? Here in front? Right.
This is not a question, but it's a statement. I was at Hampton Institute, and we tried to, or we did have a sympathy march for what was going on in Selma. And as a result, I was asked not to return to Hampton. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Any reaction or other than wow?
Well, that's really not a surprise. I mean, there are lots of people who were involved, and I think, and I thank you for sharing that, because I think what we sometimes forget in all of this is that there are so many people who were involved in civil rights activity. These were white and black students who were involved. There were often students who had to decide whether or not they were going to continue in school. Some students made the decision to drop out of school, to commit themselves full-time to civil rights work. And oftentimes we don't think about the kind of sacrifices that they made. James Lawson, who was a student at Vanderbilt at the time, really was an architect of much of the nonviolent movement, nonviolent resistance. He trained folks who were involved in the sit-ins and the freedom rides. He trained many of those folks. He was expelled from Vanderbilt for his civil rights activism. So lots of folk, if you made express any interest at all in being involved in civil rights work, there was some price to be paid.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention, in Robert's book, he talks a lot about the courage of being, say, a Selma sharecropper, and just the courage it would take and the amount of intimidation you would suffer to do something like registering to vote, and just how much courage that took. And, okay,
just one more on aftermath. One of the horrors of Kent State, almost as horrible in some ways as the people who were killed, was the reaction of people afterwards. And the people in Kent who kept, all around the state of Ohio, they should have shot them all. And you hear these stories time and time and time again. A guy named Brinsley Terrell, who's an art teacher there still, remembered a kid who had been active in the protest. He goes home. The campus is shut down afterwards. It's shut down for 5 weeks, I think, something like that. He goes home afterwards. He goes up to the door. The front door is locked. The letter slot goes open, and he hears his parents' voice from saying inside, "We never want to see you again." And he goes back, and he goes to Brinsley Terrell's house, and he just sits there and cries in his living room. It just broke my heart to hear the story. But there's stories like that. Dean Kaler, who was crippled for life, he had an uncle tell him, at a thing, they should have shot them all again. It was a refrain, and you must have heard it too. I mean, it happened time and time again. And you forget how ugly America was and how divided America was in the end of the 60s and the 70s, early 70s. And those are heartbreaking accounts. And go ahead.
Okay. Here in front.
Yes. What, if anything, were positive outcomes of these events for both authors?
Well, the obvious positive outcome of Selma, despite the 3 lives lost, Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeve, and Violet Liuzzo, and there was a 4th who was killed several months later in a town called Hayneville, Alabama, Jonathan Daniels, the young white seminary student who was murdered trying to protect a young African-American girl from being shot in a general merchandise store. He was shot point blank with the shotgun and killed instantly. He was the 4th martyr of this movement. The most positive outcome, of course, would be the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, being signed into law by President Johnson on August the 6th of 1965. And John Lewis, who suffered the worst beating on the bridge, the beatings and the injuries that the marchers suffered range from sprains to bruises, the cuts to many folk had broken teeth. John Lewis had suffered a skull fracture, and he sustained the worst beating. But the most positive, of course, would be the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And as a consequence of that, African Americans in Selma and across Alabama registered in unprecedented numbers. The process of registering became very easy. And black folk took advantage of the new law, not just in Alabama, but across the South. The numbers of African Americans who were registered soared, and they had sweet revenge. It was either the next year or the year after when they had a chance to vote Jim Clark out of office as being sheriff. So they had a chance to exact a bit of the revenge. But there was also a flip side, and that was that as the number of African Americans increased voter registration, there was also an increase of whites who began to register to sort of counter the growth of that movement. But clearly, over the next decade, you began to see increasing numbers of African Americans being elected to so many positions, local, statewide, being elected to Congress. But interestingly, one of the biggest impediments to black people being elected to local office was the fact that oftentimes other blacks would not support them. And they would share the story, say, I'm not going to vote for you because I know if I vote for you, that's going to be a bullet in your brain, and it's going to lead to your death. And I'm not going to be the one to put a nail in your coffin. So there was still that sense of dread and that overarching sense of fear that persisted for a long time.
I would say it's very hard to find a positive that came out of this. You could say that armed guardsmen, have never again been called on to an American college or university campus. So I guess that's a positive. I think, and the subtitle of my book is kind of grandiose, Kent State and the End of American Innocence, but I think in a way it did exactly what people had hoped it would do in some way, that it was the cost of activism was too high. And you just see a sharp drop-off from that point back. Now, of course, the Vietnam War was winding down. There's a moment there's an after-action report. Robert Canterbury, who's the general in charge of the Guard, he was, the after-action report, how many tanks did you have, how many men, all that sort of stuff. And the last 2 questions asked in it are problems encountered, lessons learned. And beside both of them, Canterbury wrote none. And to me, those nuns are again, I think the answer is none. I don't think we learned much from it, and I'm sorry to say.
We've got time for maybe a couple quick questions.
Just a couple factors. I grew up in the town neighboring to Kent, and actually went to kindergarten at Kent State. Siblings went to university there, and I was downtown. Just a couple things to remember. There was a draft, and I don't remember what year the draft ended, but my brother graduated from Kent State University. Then he went to Vietnam. So on a personal note, there were probably, those personal stories, but pervasively in society, there was a great divide, as Howard mentioned, and veterans received zero respect, when they came back, just generally. Another thing is the National Guard were exhausted. So physically, they were physically drained. So, they were on edge. So I think we need to remember that. The third thing.
Let me just stop it there, and so we have time for other questions.
Oh,
I was just saying, your book is really clear about the sort of the state of the Guard. And
It's really fascinating. The Guard who had done the shooting were ended up being deposed at least 3 times. And the first time they're deposed, they're saying exactly what their commander told them to say. And the second time, they're getting away from that. And by the third time, you start to live inside their brain if you keep reading them. And how, they saw people who were 70 yards away as being 30 feet away. I mean, it's demonstrable how far away they were. And inside a gas mask, life is different. The draft lottery was 1969. So that was a big thing. And then if I had my glasses on, I could do what my notes said. There we are. I opened this book. I tried to figure out how to open the book, and I finally ended up opening the book with thumbnail sketches of the 24 people who died in Vietnam. 24 American servicemen and men, in this case, who died in Vietnam on May 4th, 1970. And I wanted to make that point, that this was the context. This was one horrible burst, but that was years and years of ultimately, it ended up with 57,000 dead. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Have a microphone for next question? Okay, they're in the back.
Just a comment. Originally, before the Guard came out on the campus, the students had actually assembled to have a mock ceremony of the burial of the Constitution at their Liberty Bell, which I think is one of the great ironies that sort of kicked off the whole event. But afterwards, there was a grand jury or a series of hearings concerning the Guard, because when, at the end of the day, they all stacked their weapons. So it was impossible to trace the weapon to the individuals. Mm-hmm. And at the same time that the group that fired, on the other side of Taylor Hall, there's the group that didn't.
Yeah.
What was the conclusion of those hearings, and was anyone held responsible?
No. Ultimately, it became a civil case. And the civil case was finally decided, as I remember the date, 11 years later. $800,000, I may be off by $50,000, was awarded to the 9 students who had been shot and were still alive. By the time the lawyer got out of there, and Dean Kaler, the one who was wounded, got $350,000. The rest of them got, I think it was $35,000 or $40,000, and the families of the 4 dead got $15,000 each, enough to put them in the ground. And all that money was paid by the state of Ohio.
Yeah. And that's in the book, detailing the kind of levels of investigation and court cases, and all that aftermath is covered really nicely.
Not only were the guns stacked, they were relatively quickly sent back to the Kilkenny Army Depot in Pennsylvania. 12,000 of them were sent back there at one big load, no identification whatsoever. So.
Okay. I have a question, if I may. Sure. Mr. Means raised the word activism, and in both cases, in both your stories, it is young people that are involved. What do you think it would take to get our young people active, and what do you think is the best form of protest?
Donald Trump.
Could we have a shorter answer, please?
In the couple of weeks in the aftermath of President Trump's election, I should be respectful, And a couple weeks after that, there was a lot of anger on college campuses. I'm sure you all saw it. Students were protesting. I'm sure there was some in Charlottesville. They were all across the country. There were many in Athens, Georgia, on UGA's campus. And we didn't want folk to do things that would cause them to get into trouble with the authorities. And so several folk in my department said the best thing for us to do is to have some kind of open forum to give students an opportunity to vent. We scheduled this in a room that would hold about 125. We thought that would have been more than sufficient. If we had tried to do something like this before the election, we might have gotten 15 people to come out. The room was overflowing. They were sitting in the floor. They were hanging out the door. We hadn't seen this kind of enthusiasm for a long time. And there were a lot of people who were lamenting the election of Trump on the 7th of November. But I talked to a good friend of mine. He says, we really should not be sad. This gives us something to keep fighting for. Because the worst thing that we can ever encounter in our society is complacency and apathy. And you don't want students, anybody, young or old, to get to reach the point that we have won all the battles and we've got nothing left to fight for. And so the silver lining that I see in this cloud is that folk have something to fight for, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, regardless of what your issue is, whether it's health care, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's LGBT issues, whether it's whatever. There is something here for everybody. And I have seen on my campus, I've seen a level of student activism that I haven't seen in quite some time. And so I think that will continue.
March for Science, April 22nd. March for Climate Change, April 29th.
This is somewhat oblique, but I think we've lost a sense of ourselves as a civic body. And my immediate response when you said that was, we need national service. We need compulsory national service. I don't see any other way to give ourselves a sense of common purpose. And I think activism arises to some extent a large extent out of a sense of common purpose.
Okay, we have maybe time for one more quick question, if anyone has one. Microphone's on its way.
Again, I guess we could question or debate. I graduated from Kent State. I was there 89 to 91, so I was there at the 20th anniversary when they commemorated the memorial. And I know that the guardsmen came over from the Rubber Bowl and had been involved in some activity and had.
Wait, I'm sorry, we've got time for just a really quick question.
Sure. Being on campus, when you write about the troops being up near the pagoda,
right,
they're looking down on this parking lot. When you get there and you see the vantage point that the guardsmen had, and you mentioned Jeffrey Miller was the closest fatality 75 yards away. Try throwing a brick uphill 75 yards. I mean, it just, you can read about it, but unless you're really there, it just doesn't make sense. The trying to figure it all out just doesn't make sense.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have to give Kent State great credit for putting together a wonderful walking tour that you can do now. They have a museum there that reminds me a lot of the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham. It's a smaller version of that, very high quality, and the narration as you walk around by Julian Bond that's eloquent. So I recommend, if you happen to find yourself in Cleveland or Akron with a little time to kill, head up to Kent State.
Thank you. I'm going to stop things there with a couple of final announcements. Reminder to complete the evaluation form. Reminder the authors are going to be staying afterwards to chat and sign books. Please support them. And please join me in thanking the authors for a really good presentation.
And thanks to all of you. You've been a great audience.
Thank you for coming. Yeah. You made it possible. You weren't speaking to empty chairs.
That's nice.